The wind howled across the Apache Range, a desolate stretch of New Mexico territory where the earth itself seemed to bleed dust and memory. Jack Redding sat on the warped porch of his crumbling shack, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his calloused fingers. The sun was dying behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of blood and ash. At 52, Jack's face was a map of scars and regret, each line etched by a life he could neither escape nor forget. His graying hair hung limp beneath a tattered hat, and his eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, were clouded with the haze of too many nights spent drowning his past. He took a swig, the burn of the liquor a familiar punishment. 20 years ago, he'd been a man of purpose, a hired gun for the government, chasing bounties and land grants through the territories. He'd ridden with the Black Hawk Settlement Force, a band of mercenaries cloaked in the thin veneer of official sanction. Their mission was simple: clear the land of its native inhabitants to make way for settlers, railroads, and progress. Jack had been good at it to good. He'd gunned down men, women, and sometimes worse, all for the promise of gold and a patch of dirt to call his own. But one night, one village, had broken him. The screams still echoed in his dreams, the faces of the innocent haunting every quiet moment. He'd walked away, a traitor to his own kind, and now he lived here, in a nowhere land where the ghosts of his sins could find him, but no one else would bother. The shack was a ruin, its walls sagging under the weight of time and neglect. Inside, a cot, a rusted stove, and a scattering of empty bottles were his only companions. He'd chosen this place because it was far from the world, far from the men who'd once called him brother, far from the blood he'd spilled. But no distance could outrun memory. He lifted the bottle again, but a faint sound stopped him, a rustle in the brush beyond the clearing. His hand dropped to the revolver at his hip, an old habit that refused to die. The Apache Range was no place for visitors, not unless they were lost, desperate, or hunting trouble. He stood, his boots creaking on the warped boards, and squinted into the twilight. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by a soft, pained gasp. Jack's heart quickened, not from fear but from something older, something he couldn't name. He stepped off the porch, the revolver now in hand, and moved toward the sound. The scrub and mesquite parted to reveal a figure crumpled near the edge of the forest, a girl, no older than 18, her dark hair matted with blood and dirt. Her buckskin dress was torn, and a deep gash ran across her shoulder, oozing crimson into the sand. Jack froze. She was Apache, or maybe Navajo, her features sharp and proud even in pain. For a moment, he saw another face, another girl, from a night he'd spent years trying to bury. He shook his head, banishing the ghost, and knelt beside her. She was breathing, but barely. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and fierce, and fixed on him with a mix of fear and defiance. "Don't move," Jack said, his voice rough as gravel. "You're hurt bad." She tried to speak, but only a weak cough escaped her lips. Jack holstered his gun and lifted her carefully, her weight slight against his broad frame. He carried her to the shack, kicking the door open and laying her on the cot. The wound was deep, likely from a blade, and she'd lost enough blood to make her survival uncertain. Jack rummaged through a crate for his old field kit, bandages, a needle, thread, and a flask of moonshine for disinfectant. He'd patched up worse in his mercenary days, though he hadn't touched the kit in years. As he cleaned the wound, his eyes caught on a glint at her neck, a pendant, silver and etched with a pattern of stars and a crescent moon. His hands stilled. He knew that design. He'd seen it before, on a child he'd failed to save, in a village reduced to ash. His breath caught, and the room seemed to close in around him. The girl stirred, her eyes opening again, and this time she spoke, her voice weak but clear. "Who are you?" she asked, her English accented but precise. "Jack," he said, forcing his hands to move again, threading the needle. "Don't talk. Save your strength." She watched him, her gaze unyielding despite her pain. "You're not one of them." He didn't ask who them was. He didn't need to. The Black Hawk Settlement Force was still out there, doing what they'd always done, hunting, killing, claiming land that wasn't theirs. Jack had been one of them once, and the shame of it burned hotter than the whiskey in his gut. He stitched her wound in silence, his hands steady despite the storm in his chest. When he finished, he wrapped the bandage tight and sat back, wiping the blood from his fingers. "Name's Ayanna," she said, her voice stronger now. "I escaped." "From who?" Jack asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Men with black hawks on their vests," she said, her eyes narrowing. "They burned my village, killed everyone." Jack's jaw tightened. The Black Hawk Settlement Force, his old crew. He'd known they were still active, still carving their bloody path through the territories. But hearing it from her lips made it real in a way he wasn't prepared for. He stood and turned away, grabbing the whiskey bottle to keep his hands busy. "You're safe here," he said, not looking at her. "For now." But he knew that was a lie. The Black Hawks didn't leave survivors, and they didn't forgive traitors. If they'd attacked her village, they'd be looking for her. And if they found her here, they'd find him too. He took a long pull from the bottle, the liquor doing little to dull the dread creeping up his spine. Over the next few days, Jack nursed Ayanna back to health. She was stubborn, refusing his help at first, but weakness forced her to relent. He boiled roots and herbs he'd learned about from a Navajo healer years ago, spooning broth into her mouth when she was too weak to hold a cup. She watched him warily, her eyes searching for motives he didn't have. He didn't blame her. A white man in these parts was rarely a friend to her people. On the third night, as a storm rolled in from the mountains, Ayanna sat up on the cot, her strength returning. The pendant gleamed at her neck, a constant reminder of Jack's past. He avoided looking at it, but it was no use. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the village, the flames, the bodies. He saw the child with the same pendant, her lifeless hand clutching it as he'd ridden away. Too late to save her. "Why do you live like this?" Ayanna asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the howl of the wind outside. Jack glanced at her, then back at the fire crackling in the stove. "Like what?" "Alone. Hiding. Like a ghost." He didn't answer right away. The truth was too heavy, too raw. "Some things you do, they follow you," he said finally. "No point dragging others down with you." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "You're running from something. Ain't we all?" He shot back harsher than he meant. She didn't flinch. "Not like you. I see it in your eyes. You carry death." Her words hit like a bullet. He stood abruptly, knocking over the stool, and grabbed his coat. "Get some rest," he muttered, stepping out into the storm. The rain lashed his face, cold and relentless, but it was better than facing her gaze. She saw too much, knew too much, even if she didn't know the details. He walked to the edge of the clearing, letting the storm drown out the memories threatening to surface. But the past was a hunter, and it always found its mark. 2 days later, as dawn broke over the range, Jack spotted tracks in the dirt near the shack boot prints, too many for one man. He crouched, his fingers tracing the marks, his heart pounding. The Black Hawks were close. He'd known they'd come eventually, but not this soon. He checked his revolver, counting the rounds, and scanned the horizon. The mountains loomed like silent judges, offering no mercy. Inside, Ayanna was awake, her wound healing but still tender. She sensed his tension immediately. "They're coming, aren't they?" she said, her voice steady. Jack nodded. "You need to leave. Head north, through the pass. There's a settlement there, might take you in." "I'm not leaving," she said, standing despite the pain. "They killed my people. I won't run." "You'll die if you stay," Jack snapped. "You think you can fight them? A girl with a knife and a bad shoulder?" Her eyes blazed. "I'd rather die fighting than live hiding." He wanted to argue, to force her to go, but something in her resolve stopped him. She reminded him of himself, years ago, before the blood and the guilt had hollowed him out. He turned away, cursing under his breath. "Fine, but you do what I say." That night, he fortified the shack as best he could, barricading the windows with old planks and setting traps in the brush. Ayanna helped, her hands quick despite her injury. They worked in silence, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them. Jack didn't know if he was protecting her out of duty or desperation, but for the first time in years, he felt something other than despair, a flicker of purpose, fragile but real. At midnight, the first shot rang out. A bullet shattered the window, spraying glass across the floor. Jack pushed Ayanna down behind the cot and returned fire, his revolver barking into the darkness. Shadows moved in the trees, and the sound of hooves echoed through the night. The Black Hawks had come, and they weren't here for mercy. The battle was chaotic, a blur of gunfire and shouts. Jack's old instincts took over, his hands steady as he reloaded and fired. Ayanna crouched beside him, clutching a knife, her eyes fierce. A man in a black vest charged the door, and Jack dropped him with a single shot. But there were more too many. He counted at least a dozen, their hawk emblems glinting in the moonlight. "Stay down," Jack yelled as another bullet tore through the wall. He grabbed a rifle from the corner, an old Winchester he hadn't touched in years, and fired into the night. A scream told him he'd hit his mark, but the return fire was relentless. The shack was falling apart, splinters flying with every shot. Ayanna crawled to the window, peering out. "They're circling," she whispered. "They're trying to trap us." Jack nodded, his mind racing. He'd fought these men before, knew their tactics. They'd burn the shack if they had to, kill everyone inside. He grabbed Ayanna's arm. "We're moving. Now." They slipped out the back, using the cover of the storm to mask their escape. The rain was a blessing, hiding their tracks, but it wouldn't last. Jack led her into the forest, his heart pounding as he scanned for movement. The Black Hawks were relentless, their shouts echoing through the trees. He knew they wouldn't stop until they had their prey. They found shelter in a shallow cave, the entrance hidden by mesquite. Ayanna was shaking, not from fear but from pain. Her wound reopened in the chaos. Jack tore a strip from his shirt and rebound it, his hands trembling for the first time. "You're gonna be fine," he said, more to himself than to her. She grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me." He didn't answer. He couldn't. The pendant at her neck was answer enough, a silent accusation he couldn't escape. Instead, he checked his revolver again, counting the rounds. 6 left. Not enough. Dawn broke, gray and heavy with the promise of more rain. Jack scouted the area, finding fresh tracks leading toward the cave. The Black Hawks were closing in. He returned to Ayanna, his face grim. "We can't stay here. They're too close. Then we fight," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. He shook his head. "You're not a killer. Don't start now." "And you are," she shot back, her eyes boring into his. "I know what you are, Jack. I've heard the stories. The man who burned villages, who killed for money." Her words cut deeper than any blade. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but the truth was a weight he couldn't shed. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "I'm not that man anymore." "Then prove it," she said. "Help me. Help us." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and something shifted inside him. For years, he'd run from his past, believing redemption was a lie. But now, with this girl staring at him, demanding he be more than his sins, he felt the stirrings of something he'd thought long dead hope. "All right," he said finally. "We'll fight. Together." They spent the day preparing, gathering what they could for traps, branches for cover. Ayanna showed him how to use the terrain, her knowledge of the land surpassing his own. She spoke little, but her actions were steady, purposeful. Jack watched her, marveling at her strength, and wondered if he'd ever been that brave. As night fell, they took position on a ridge overlooking the clearing. The Black Hawks would come soon, and Jack knew this fight would be different. This wasn't about survival, it was about atonement. He glanced at Ayanna, her knife gleaming in the moonlight, and felt a pang of fear. Not for himself, but for her. He'd failed so many before. He couldn't fail her too. The first riders appeared at dusk, their black vests stark against the pale sand. Jack raised his rifle, his hands steady, and whispered, "Here we go." The shots echoed across the Apache Range, a prelude to the storm that would decide their fate. The ridge above the clearing was a jagged scar against the twilight sky, its edges softened by the relentless wind of the Apache Range. Jack Redding crouched behind a boulder, his Winchester resting on his knee, its barrel cold against his palm. Beside him, Ayanna gripped her knife, her breath steady despite the blood seeping through the bandage on her shoulder. The Black Hawk settlement force was coming, their hoofbeats a distant thunder rolling across the New Mexico territory. Jack's heart pounded, not from fear of death had faced that too many times to care, but from the weight of what he stood to lose. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting for himself. The riders emerged from the shadows, their black vests marked with the hawk emblem that still haunted Jack's dreams. There were 10 of them, maybe 12, their rifles glinting in the fading light. He recognized their formation tight, disciplined, the same one he'd ridden in years ago. At their head was a man Jack knew too well, Caleb Voss, his former second in command. A weary killer with eyes like a rattlesnake's. Caleb had been his friend once, or as close to a friend as men like them could have. Now, he was a hunter, and Jack was his prey. "Stay low," Jack whispered to Ayanna. "Wait for my signal." She nodded, her dark eyes fixed on the riders. Her pendant caught the moonlight, a silent reminder of the debt Jack could never repay. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. The traps they'd set sharpened stakes hidden in the brush. Rocks rigged to fall wouldn't stop the Black Hawks, but they might slow them down. He needed every advantage. The first trap sprung as a horse screamed, its leg caught in a concealed pit. The rider fell, and Jack fired, the Winchesters crack splitting the night. The man dropped without a sound, but the others reacted instantly, scattering for cover. Bullets tore into the ridge, kicking up dirt and stone. Ayanna flinched but held her ground, her knife ready. Jack reloaded, his hands steady despite the chaos. He'd been in worse fights, but never with so much at stake. "Move," he hissed, pulling Ayanna toward a gully. They slid down the embankment, the sound of gunfire echoing above. The Black Hawks were closing in, their shouts sharp and commanding. Jack knew their tactics: flush out the target, surround, eliminate. He'd taught them some of those moves himself. In the gully, they caught their breath. Ayanna's face was pale, her wound bleeding again, but her eyes burned with defiance. "We can't keep running," she said. "They'll find us." "I know," Jack said, checking his rounds. "But we pick the ground. Make them come to us." She nodded, and for a moment, he saw something in her, not just anger or fear, but trust. It was a fragile thing, and it terrified him more than the guns behind them. He didn't deserve it, not after what he'd done. But there was no time to dwell. The Black Hawks were moving, their shadows darting through the trees. They crept through the gully, staying low as moonlight filtered through the mesquite. Jack's mind raced, piecing together a plan. The Apache Range was unforgiving, but it was also familiar. He'd ridden these trails as a mercenary, mapping every canyon and ridge. There was a narrow pass a mile west, a bottleneck where they could hold off a larger force. If they could reach it, they might survive the night. But fate had other plans. As they emerged from the gully, a figure stepped into their path, an old woman. Her face weathered like the desert itself, her eyes sharp and unyielding. She wore a tattered shawl, and her hands clutched a staff carved with symbols Jack didn't recognize. He raised his rifle, but Ayanna grabbed his arm. "No," she whispered. "She's one of us." The woman's gaze locked on Jack, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You," she said, her voice low and accusing. "The butcher of Red Canyon." Jack's blood ran cold. Red Canyon, the village he'd burned, the lives he'd taken. He'd spared one soul that night, a woman who'd begged for mercy as he'd turned away from the flames. He hadn't known why he'd let her live, a guilt, weakness, or something else. Now, she stood before him, a living ghost of his sins. "You know him?" Ayanna asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. The old woman nodded, her eyes never leaving Jack. "He spared me once, but his hands are red with the blood of my people." Ayanna's grip tightened on her knife, her gaze shifting to Jack. "Is it true?" He wanted to lie, to deny it, but the truth was a noose he couldn't escape. "It's true," he said quietly. "I was a different man then." "Men don't change," the old woman said. "They only hide." Before Jack could respond, a child's cry pierced the night. A boy no older than 7 stumbled from the brush, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He ran to Ayanna, clinging to her, his body trembling. She knelt, whispering to him in a language Jack didn't understand. The boy was mute, his eyes wide with terror, but he pointed back toward the trees. "They're coming," Ayanna said, her voice tight. "My brother, Taza. He was with me when they attacked our village." Jack's heart sank. Another life to protect, another weight on his shoulders. He looked at the old woman, then at Ayanna. "We need to move. Now." The old woman shook her head. "There's no running from them. Not anymore." "She's right," Ayanna said. "We fight, or we die." Jack cursed under his breath. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and saddled with a wounded girl, a mute boy, and an old woman who hated him. But he saw the fire in Ayanna's eyes, the same fire he'd lost years ago. He nodded. The pass, west of here. We can hold them there. They moved quickly. The old woman whose name, they learned, was Nijana, leading the way with a surprising speed. Taza clung to Ayanna, his small hand gripping hers. Jack brought up the rear, his rifle ready, every sound in the dark a potential threat. The pass was a narrow cut through the mountains, its walls steep and littered with loose rock. It was a defender's dream, but only if they could reach it before the Black Hawks. They didn't. Halfway to the pass, the riders caught up. A bullet grazed Jack's arm, drawing blood, and he shoved Ayanna and Taza behind a boulder. Najoni stood her ground, her staff raised like a weapon. "Go," she shouted. "I'll hold them." "No," Ayanna cried, but Jack pulled her back. Najoni's eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw something like forgiveness or maybe just understanding. Najoni chanted, her voice rising over the gunfire, a song of defiance and sorrow. The Black Hawks hesitated, unnerved by the sound, and Jack used the distraction to fire, dropping to riders. But there were too many. A bullet struck Najoni's shoulder, and she staggered but didn't fall. She raised her staff higher, her chant growing louder, and Jack realized she was buying them time. "Move," he roared, dragging Ayanna and Taza toward the pass. The boy's silence was a knife in Jack's chest, a reminder of the innocence he'd destroyed in others. They reached the pass just as Najoni's chant faltered, replaced by a scream. Jack didn't look back. He couldn't. The pass was as he remembered, narrow, defensible, a choke point where numbers meant less. He positioned Ayanna and Taza behind a rock outcropping, handing her his spare revolver. "You know how to use this." She nodded, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. "My father taught me." "Good," Jack said. "Stay here. Shoot anything that moves." He climbed to a higher vantage point, his rifle trained on the entrance to the pass. The Black Hawks were coming, their shouts echoing through the canyon. Caleb's voice cut through the noise, cold and commanding. "Redding, you can't run forever." Jack didn't answer. He waited, his breath steady, his finger on the trigger. The first rider appeared, and Jack fired, the man slumping from his saddle. Chaos erupted as the Black Hawks returned fire, their bullets chipping the rock around him. Ayanna fired from below, her shots wild, but enough to keep the riders cautious. The battle stretched on, a brutal dance of lead and blood. Jack's arm burned where the bullet had grazed him, but he ignored it. He had to protect the Mayana, Taza, and the memory of Najoni's sacrifice. He fired again, dropping another man, but the Black Hawks were relentless, their numbers wearing him down. Then, a miracle. A rock slide, triggered by the gunfire, roared down the pass, crushing to riders and blocking the path. The Black Hawks retreated, their curses fading into the night. Jack slumped against the rock, his chest heaving. Ayanna climbed up to him, Taza in tow, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "They'll be back," she said. "I know," Jack replied, "but we're alive." She looked at him, her eyes searching. "Why did she call you the butcher?" He turned away, the weight of her question crushing him. "Because I was," he said finally. "I killed her people. Your people. I didn't know they were innocent, but that don't change what I did." Ayanna was silent for a long moment. "You saved us tonight. That changes something." He didn't believe her, not really. But her words stirred something in him, a spark of hope he didn't dare trust. They spent the night in the pass, taking turns keeping watch. Taza slept curled against Ayanna, his silence a constant reminder of the cost of violence. Jack didn't sleep. He couldn't. The Black Hawks would come again, and he had to be ready. At dawn, they moved deeper into the mountains, seeking a place to regroup. Ayanna led them to a hidden spring, a place her people had once considered sacred. There they found signs of recent habitation tracks, a fire pit, a scrap of cloth. Ayanna's face lit up with hope. "Survivors," she whispered. "There are others." But Jack's gut told him otherwise. The tracks were too precise, the fire too controlled. "It's a trap," he said. "They're baiting us." Ayanna's hope faded, replaced by resolve. "Then we spring it. On our terms." Jack nodded, a plan forming. The Black Hawks wanted them to run, to panic. But he was done running. He'd face them, not as the butcher of Red Canyon, but as a man fighting for something worth saving. Ayanna and Taza deserved that much. They prepared for the next fight, using the spring's terrain to their advantage. Ayanna showed Jack how to blend into the landscape, a skill her people had perfected over generations. Taza, though silent, helped gather rocks for traps, his small hands steady. Jack watched them, marveling at their resilience, and felt the weight of his past shift, just a little. As night fell, the Black Hawks returned, their numbers thinned but their resolve unbroken. Jack spotted Caleb at the forefront, his face a mask of cold determination. This wasn't just about land or bounties anymore, it was personal. Jack had betrayed them, and Caleb would make him pay. The fight was brutal, a clash of steel and fire in the shadow of the mountains. Jack fought with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years, each shot a defiance of the man he'd been. Ayanna fought beside him, her revolver barking, her knife flashing when a rider got too close. Taza stayed hidden, his eyes wide but unyielding. In the chaos, Jack faced Caleb. The two men stood across the clearing, their guns raised, the past hanging between them like a noose. "You should have stayed with us, Jack," Caleb said, his voice low. "You were one of us." "I was never one of you," Jack replied. "Not really." Caleb's smile was cold. "You'll die a traitor." The shot rang out before Jack could respond. Pain seared his side, and he staggered, but he fired back, his bullet finding Caleb's shoulder. The Black Hawk leader fell, cursing, and the others hesitated, giving Jack and Ayanna a chance to retreat. They fled deeper into the mountains, bloodied but alive. Ayanna's wound had reopened, and Jack's side burned, but they kept moving. Taza clung to Ayanna, his silence louder than any cry. As they collapsed by the spring, Jack looked at them, at the family he hadn't chosen but couldn't abandon. "We can't keep this up," Ayanna said, her voice hoarse. "There's too many." "I know," Jack said, "but we don't stop. Not now." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something like forgiveness in her eyes. "You're not the man they say you are," she said. "Not anymore." He didn't answer. He didn't know if she was right, but for the first time, he wanted to believe it. The Black Hawks would come again, and the fight was far from over. But as he bandaged Ayanna's wound and Taza's small hand gripped his, Jack felt something he hadn't in years, a reason to keep going. The Apache Range was a furnace of dust and fury as a sandstorm brewed on the horizon. Its howl a grim prelude to the battle Jack Redding knew would be his last stand. He crouched in a shallow ravine, his side throbbing where Caleb's bullet had torn through flesh. The wound was bad, but he'd had worse. Beside him, Ayanna checked the revolver he'd given her, her hands steady despite the blood seeping through her bandage. Taza, her mute younger brother, huddled close, his eyes wide but resolute, clutching a sharpened stick as if it were a spear. The spring where they'd taken refuge was a sacred place, Ayanna had said, but to Jack, it was just another piece of dirt to defender he'd die for if it meant keeping them alive. The Black Hawk settlement force was coming. Jack had wounded their leader, Caleb Voss, in the last fight, but that only made them hungrier for blood. The hawk-emblazoned vests were a mark of death, a symbol of the life Jack had left behind. He'd been one of them once, a mercenary who'd burned villages for gold and land. But the memory of Red Canyon's village where he'd killed innocents, including a child whose pendant matched Ayanna had broken him. Now, he fought not for redemption, which he didn't believe in, but for something simpler, to give Ayanna and Taza a chance to live. "They're close," Ayanna whispered, her voice cutting through the wind. She'd learned to read the land better than Jack ever had, her Apache blood attuned to its rhythms. 10, maybe 12. Jack nodded, his Winchester resting against a rock. His revolver, the same one he'd used in Red Canyon, was heavy at his hip, a cursed thing. But it would serve one last time. "Stay behind me," he said. "If it goes south, take Taza and run. Don't look back." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "I'm not leaving you. You'll if I tell you to," he snapped, harsher than he meant. Her stubbornness was a mirror of his own, and it scared him. He couldn't lose her, not like he'd lost so many others. Taza tugged at Ayanna's sleeve, pointing to the ridge above. Jack followed his gaze and saw movement slipping through the mesquite, silent as wolves. The Black Hawks were here. He took a deep breath, the air thick with sand and the scent of coming rain. "Get ready," he said. The first shot came without warning, a bullet grazing the rock above Jack's head. He fired back, the Winchester's crack echoing through the ravine. A man fell, his black vest stark against the pale earth. Ayanna fired too, her aim steadier now, and Taza threw rocks, his small frame trembling but unyielding. The Black Hawks pressed forward, their numbers overwhelming, their gunfire relentless. Jack's trap ropes tied to loose boulders, pits dug in the sand slowed them, but not enough. Caleb's voice cut through the chaos, cold and familiar. "Redding, you can't save them. You couldn't save anyone." Jack's jaw tightened. Caleb knew him too well, knew how to twist the knife of his guilt. He fired again, dropping another rider, but the Black Hawks were closing in, their horses charging through the storm. A bullet struck Jack's shoulder, and he staggered, blood soaking his shirt. Ayanna grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Don't you dare give up," she said, her voice fierce. He managed a grim smile. "Not planning to." They fell back to the spring, its waters glinting under the storm-darkened sky. The Black Hawks surrounded them, their rifles trained. Caleb rode forward, his shoulder bandaged but his eyes burning with hate. "You should have stayed loyal, Jack," he said. "We could have owned this land." "This land ain't yours," Jack replied, his voice steady despite the pain. "Never was." Caleb laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Still playing the hero? You're no better than us." Red Canyon proved that. The words hit harder than the bullet in Jack's shoulder. He saw Ayanna's eyes flicker, her trust wavering. She knew his past, but hearing it from Caleb made it real again. "He's not that man anymore," she said, stepping forward, her revolver raised. "You are." Caleb's smile faded. "Kill them," he ordered. The world exploded into gunfire. Jack shoved Ayanna and Taza behind a boulder, firing blindly into the storm. The Black Hawks were everywhere, their bullets tearing through the air. Jack's shoulder burned, his vision blurring, but he kept fighting. Each shot a defiance of the man he'd been. Ayanna fired beside him, her face set with determination, and Taza's rocks found their mark, one striking a rider in the head. Then a figure emerged from the storm Nizoni, the old woman Jack had spared in Red Canyon. She'd been shot in the last fight, left for dead, but here she was, her staff raised, her voice rising in a chant that seemed to shake the earth. The Black Hawks hesitated, unnerved by the sound, and Jack seized the moment, firing into their ranks. Najoni's chant grew louder, a song of loss and vengeance, and she charged forward, her frail body a shield. "No," Ayanna screamed, but Najoni didn't stop. A bullet struck her chest, and she fell, her chant fading into the wind. Her sacrifice gave them a chance. Jack grabbed Ayanna and Taza, pulling them toward a narrow trail leading out of the spring. "Move," he roared. They ran, the storm swallowing their tracks. The Black Hawks pursued, but the sandstorm was their ally now, blinding their enemies. Jack's wounds slowed him, his breath ragged, but he pushed on, Ayanna and Taza ahead of him. They reached a cliff overlooking the range, the storm raging around them. There was nowhere left to run. Jack turned to face the Black Hawks, his revolver in hand. Caleb emerged from the dust, his face twisted with rage. "This ends now, Jack," he said, raising his gun. Jack didn't flinch. "It ended in Red Canyon," he said. "I just didn't know it." The two men fired at the same time. Jack's bullet struck Caleb's chest, and he fell, his eyes wide with surprise. Caleb's bullet hit Jack's leg, and he collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Ayanna screamed, firing at the remaining Black Hawks, who scattered as the storm intensified. Taza threw himself over Jack, his small body shielding him, and Ayanna dragged them both behind a rock. "Stay with me," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't get to die now." Jack managed a weak laugh. "Bossy, ain't you?" She tore strips from her dress, binding his wounds as best she could. The Black Hawks were retreating, their numbers decimated, the storm too fierce to continue. Jack's vision faded, but he clung to consciousness, Ayanna's voice anchoring him. "You saved us," she said. "You did what you said you couldn't." He shook his head, the pendant at her neck glinting in the dim light. "I didn't save them," he whispered. "Not back then." She took his hand, her grip fierce. "You saved us now. That's enough." The storm passed, leaving a quiet that felt unnatural after the chaos. The Black Hawks were gone, their bodies scattered across the range. Jack, Ayanna, and Taza were alive, bloodied but unbroken. They made their way back to the spring, where Najoni's body lay, her staff still clutched in her hand. Ayanna knelt beside her, tears falling, and sang a soft song in her language, a farewell to the woman who'd given everything. Days turned to weeks, and the survivors found other scattered remnants of Ayanna's people. Hiding in the mountains, they built a small village near the spring, a place of mud and wood, but it was theirs. Jack, his wounds slow to heal, helped where he could, hammering nails and hauling timber. His hands, once stained with blood, now built instead of destroyed. Ayanna taught him the ways of her people, and he taught her to shoot straight, to plant crops, to survive in a world that didn't forgive. One evening, as the sun set over the new village, Ayanna called Jack to the spring. Taza was there, holding a small wooden carving he'd made a hawk, its wings broken. He handed it to Jack, his eyes speaking what his voice couldn't. Jack took it, his throat tight. "Thank you, kid," he said. Ayanna smiled, her pendant gleaming. "He wants you to stay," she said. "So do I." Jack looked at the village, at the homes they'd built, at the people who'd accepted him despite his past. He didn't deserve it, but he'd stopped arguing with grace. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." Years passed, and the village grew. Ayanna became its leader, her strength and wisdom blending tradition with the new world. She wore her pendant proudly, a symbol of survival, not loss. Taza found his voice, soft at first, but growing stronger, telling stories of the spring, of Najoni, of the man who'd fought for them. Jack grew older, his scars a map of battles won and lost, but he smiled now, a real smile, as he watched the village thrive. One day, as he sat by the spring, Ayanna joined him. She was a woman now, her eyes carrying the weight of leadership, but also its hope. "You kept your promise," she said. "You gave us a home." He looked at her, at the pendant, at the village beyond. "You gave me one too," he said. The Apache Range was no longer a place of ghosts for Jack. It was a place of life, of second chances. He'd never erase his past, but he'd built something new with his present. And that, he realized, was enough.